Hello, namaste everybody, and thank you for joining us today with CoHNA. We're very excited to have all of you here today for a topic that is unfortunately not so exciting. But anyways, let's get into it. Why are we here today? We want to talk about caste, which has actually become a big obsession in both the US media and academia. And we're going to parse apart this very complex topic today to see why it has become the big issue that it has become, and how it's going to impact all of us, how it is already impacting the Hindu Americans living and working in their day to day lives and workplaces. Very excited that we have here today two experts in the field. Let's welcome Dr. Ramesh Rao, who has earned a PhD in communication studies from Michigan State University, and since then has been teaching in the United States, I think since 1987, and he has taught at a number of different universities, and is now at Georgia. And he has also co authored a book on intercultural communications, and we will actually put a link to it in the replay. So, those of you who watch the replay can check out and get this great resource. Ramesh ji has also worked as a bank officer, a school teacher, a copy editor, in addition to his academic career. And he is a prolific author, having published in several American, Indian, and British newspapers and magazines. So we're very excited to have him join us to give us the scholarly perspective on why caste has assumed the narrative it has in the media. And our other speaker is Nikunj Trivedi, who is the president of CoHNA, who has spent 20 years both in the Hindu activist space, both with Hindu Students Council and now with CoHNA, and I'm sure a number of other organizations. Nikunj has spent a number of years researching and educating on the complex topics of swastika, caste, Hindu phobia. So I think it's going to be an exciting panel. So thank you again for joining us, everybody. And I think we'd just like to go ahead and get started. So, um, we have just for the audience, a few logistics for the audience before we do that. So, you can send in your comments and questions in the chat boxes if you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook Live. We will see them. We will hold questions to the end because we have a lot of stuff we want to get through. To the discussion, we will also use a few slides just as reminders or to make a point or to make a visual reinforce some issues that we're talking about. So this is not a presentation per se, so slides will come and go. If we have technical difficulties, bear with us. So I'd like to open up the discussion now with firstly, why are we even here as in Hindu Americans talking about caste, right? Most of us think it's an arcane thing. If it was impacting our lives in India, we've certainly left it behind. Almost every Indian American I have talked to says that caste is really not a part of their life. And it's not just anecdotal, data bears us out. Recent survey from Carnegie Endowment showed that caste was a very, very limited part of a very, very limited set of people. I think barely 25% of the people surveyed said it was even something that played a factor in the formation of their networks. And so I think, but yet, if you look at the narrative, every coverage about India, every coverage about Hindus seems to be caste obsessed. That's not new, as Professor Rao will tell us. But let's first talk about why it's a problem and why we are here today. So, Nikunj, do you want to throw up that first slide where we just want to show that if you think we are getting a little overexcited and ahead for ourselves, let's look at what's been happening over the last couple of years. So, back in 2016, 2018, a group called Equality Labs published what it calls a caste survey. We won't talk about it in detail, but just bear in mind that the survey was demolished from a scientific perspective almost immediately when it was launched. And I think most people thought that was the end of it. It was such a poorly done survey that nobody really expected it to go anywhere. And at the end of the day, people have the freedom to do whatever they want in their own time, whether they do faulty surveys or do any other issue, that's kind of their problem. Unfortunately, it's taken legs, and look at all the stuff that it has led to, like almost like, dominoes falling. So there was a congressional briefing in 2019. A private university adopted caste as a protected category. The infamous Cisco caste lawsuit, which will come up today for discussion, was filed in June 2020. All of the in February of this year, UC Davis, they had their student body passed a resolution, a highly Hindu phobic resolution. You can actually find its rebuttal on the CoHNA website. The student resolution asked for caste to be made a protected category. This was followed by the Cal Poly Cal State system. So that's a massive university body system within the California university system. There was also at the same time we saw Santa Clara County, home of the tech industry, try to add human rights. Its Human Rights Commission try to add caste as a protected category. And then recently, in the last few months, we have seen caste does get added to the protected category in UC Davis. Some movement from Harvard, where graduate students have been granted caste protection, and UC San Diego Ethnic Studies. We'll actually talk about it in a minute. So I think this really frames the issue of why caste discussion is a problem. And I'd love to just open it up there. Dr. Rao, I know you had some thoughts on this.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. There is an echo. Is there something that I'm doing?
No, we can hear you.
You're fine now.
Okay, good. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to talk today about this infamous caste issue, which seems to dog us wherever we go. But then very quickly, very briefly, just in terms of my own, experience here in the US, I came to the US in 1985 as a graduate student. I have had Indian roommates. I started in Mississippi, went to Michigan, where I got my PhD. And then I have worked in Missouri, in Virginia, now here in Georgia. And been part of temples, temple associations. I've had, friends, colleagues who are Indian. And I don't believe at any point in time in these last 36 years that anyone really has brought up a caste issue. No one even asks anyone to identify what jati they belong to. We go to the temple, Okay, there are various people in charge from a variety of communities. And here again, because nothing in India, nothing about Hindu is simple. We have a variety of people. We reflect real diversity in terms of our backgrounds, our language, the region, the places we come from, all kinds of stuff. And if jati, if it is indeed any aspect of our life, it is just one of the myriad such features of being Indian. Okay. With that said, it is now, as I think about this and as to why there is this new surge, and the surge is not just interesting for its own sake, but in terms of how it is being used, conflated with race, with color, with discrimination, and how we are grouped together, interestingly, with white supremacists. So if you are a Hindu, let alone be a Brahmana like me, I am in various narratives put together with those who have used race in a supremacist, monopolistic way to discriminate others, to be violent against others. And I really wonder, therefore, what has happened? Why, especially, again, the surge, which is, we need to do more work on this, even in terms of media mention of the term caste. I did a quick search a few days ago, and I found that in 2020, the number of mentions of caste in media across the world, that ProQuest, the database that mines such information, there were something like 53,000 mentions of caste. You suddenly wonder what it is. How did we go viral? you know, where is this deluge coming from? Of course, one reason could be that Isabel Wilkerson's work last year that led to a kind of a splurge here in the US, and how that book, certain books don't simply get traction because of their own quality, but it is because of the way various forces, media, academic, make that happen. Okay. With that said, I think the other thing that we need to keep in mind in terms of why this new interest, and also this kind of demonizing of jati, is because we now have also the second generation of Indian Americans, Hindu Americans, the young, who are going to college, who are in college, who have graduated, who have been fed narratives about who we are, who they are, and they have not really had any kind of that kind of connection viscerally in these matters of jati. But because they have been, you know, given this kind of peep into their life third hand, they have become interested. And given the fact that there has been an increase in these aspects of race and discrimination here in the US, it has been easy, I think, to conflate our jati aspects with the race aspects, color aspects. And those who are in that kind of social activist mode find it easy to latch on to this and to make this not only prominent for others, but it is also really a career move. For so many, this is something that they hold on to because they don't have anything else to offer society. Okay, that is my introduction to this. We will come back to this in terms of, the Western colonial connections, foundations, history of using a category, or of bringing a category into play that now over the past 120 years has taken on a life of its own. And of course, we also have to keep in mind that in 1947, when India became independent, and because of the kinds of concerns that people had about uh, those groups of people uh, who were not privileged, who needed support, and that itself now has taken on a life of its own beyond the first 10 years that those reservations were guaranteed for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And now we have the backward caste, the other backward castes, on and on and on. And now that we are part of the global village, those things, and our academics trained in India, who are also now part of American academia, bringing all of those kinds of things, trying to crystallize it, trying to make it more important than it is, and to give it a characterization and a life that which is not natural. These are imposed kinds of narratives. But
Right.
let's make that my introductory spiel here.
Yes, right. And I actually don't, I think maybe that's a good segue into one of the slides you had shared with us because, we are talking about how this narrative has come about. And it's actually a construct, as we like to call it. So if we just put up that once, and it has deep roots, as you were talking about, and it's been subject to a lot of academic analysis on the other side too. I mean, so I think it's important to sort of dig into how, as this narrative has been constructed over the past few decades, folks have actually been realizing this and sort of picking apart at it and trying to highlight that issue. So I'd love for you to just walk us through some of this stuff. And Nikunj, I know this is an area you talk about a lot as well, is how this concept came to be, because it's so interesting. Obviously, India, there is, we are all in the US, but we are, Indian issues certainly are important. And India certainly has a lot of problems, like any other country. There's discrimination in Indian society, like there is discrimination in other societies. The interesting thing is why discrimination in Indian society is then given religious aspects, and I think that's something we'd love to hear and talk about.
So, Nikunj, would you like to take this up and for me to follow? How would you?
No, it's fine. So like we can do tag teaming. But I want to make one point before we go into this. The point that you mentioned earlier about the co-opting. You see, my concern really is not it's a co-opting of the social justice movement that is happening in the United States after Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste. But even before that, what has happened is that this rush to have a social justice movement around what happened with Black Lives Matter and things like that. There are actual groups such as Equality Labs that have co-opted the social justice movement to insert into a narrative that doesn't that is a fake narrative that doesn't really have any legs. And because of the urge to equalize certain things in the United States, what has happened is people have blindly latched onto this. So no one is doing any kind of due diligence or analysis, even if like reputable institutions like Carnegie Endowment have demolished a survey like Equality Labs and says, do not rely on that survey because it has various issues. Academia, media has completely ignored that. So for me, I think what has happened is this rising social justice movement has been co-opted. And this narrative has been created that Hindus have a caste, and oh, by the way, there's a big problem in the United States somehow, and survey after survey or narratives after narratives have actually demolished that. But still, that there's a sort of a bias against our community and being completely ignored. So I think that's a really important point that our supporters, but Hindu Americans in general and Hindus in general need to understand. Whatever problems there might be in India, that's fine. That India has its own social dynamics and things like that. But that social dynamic is somehow being replicated in the United States by all this caste obsession. That if there's a Hindu in America, oh, he or she must have caste. But beyond that, he or she must be a casteist, someone who's discriminating against a certain section of their own community, things like that, even when data doesn't exist. So I think that is a very dangerous thing that is being imposed upon it. And it's kind of like colonialism. When we talk about the caste construct now coming into that, based on the research that I've been able to do, if you go back, Hindu society in general has never been monolithic, right? There have always been different types of people, jati, varna, kula, gotra, shreni, all these different indigenous concepts used to exist. And they were not monopolized, they were not homogenized or monolithic across the entire Hindu society. So while there may be certain kind of jati, varna types of discussions in one place, they're completely absent in other places. You have kings and queens and nobles and stuff like that who are from different jatis, different varnas, things like that. So that has never been monolithic until, and there's a lady by the name of Susan Bailey who actually has done research on this, that until the Mughals arrived, they sort of started to amplify the idea of caste by using certain Rajput categories across the entire Indian subcontinent, wherever they were, right? So this idea of nobility, this idea of caste was started to take place into around the Mughal time frame. And Bailey has done a good job talking about this in her book. Then comes the British, right? And this is where things get very, very interesting, right? That they introduced, like in the 1890 or 1892, the word caste was first introduced into the survey. And that's what really started to have this impact. So for the next 60 to 70 years, there was always a discussion on caste, right? The 1901 survey, as you see on the slide, has been a turning point by Risley, right? By Herbert Risley, who actually created a racist categorization of the famous 7 castes that he had in his survey to pigeonhole every single one of them, the diverse the diverse jati, varna, coms, whatever jats, whatever you want to call them, into this whole thing on caste. And that created a massive impact on the Hindu society or the Indian society in general. And here's something that we have seen from a 1921 survey that says that, this Mr. Middleton, who was one of the folks in the survey in Punjab, he basically says, we pigeonholed everyone by caste. And if we could not find a true caste for them, labeled them with the name of a hereditary occupation. We deplored the caste system and its effect on social and economic problems, but we are largely responsible for the system we deplore. And we run a 2-hour workshop on this, so happy to have people join that. But without going into a lot of the details, this quote really shows what really happened, right? So from 1891, 1892 to 1921, you can see that impact of pigeonholing everybody into a caste. And that narrative is then carried on to academia, in Indology, in many different places. And I'm sure Rameshji can talk about that. But the point here I'm trying to make is that this is how caste consciousness was developed within the society. So the elites who were in the British education, they essentially were brainwashed into thinking that, hey, you know what? Your society has caste. And by the way, it's inherently discriminatory, right? So I'll stop here, but I'll hand it to Rameshji to kind of take it from here.
Yes, and this is very important, and in so many ways, I think this conversation is also necessary, because the other concern, well, I don't know if it's a concern, but the other aspect of this new interest in caste is also because of the number of both Indians now coming here on varieties of visas for work, and the increase in the number of students from India coming here to the US. Okay. When I came in 1985, I don't know, I believe there were not more than about 5,000 students a year that came to this country, whereas now India is the second largest source or country from which students come to study here in the US. I think more than 100,000 plus each year, which means there are all of those kinds of issues that now that add to some of the kind of traction that this has got. But to go back to this idea about where this kind of reification of something that is fluid, something that was part of the normal functioning and structure of Indian society, of literally guilds, if you can think of them that way, that allowed for people to gain expertise and use that expertise in a variety of fields, that led to this idea of jati, and where jati and varna has been conflated, and which no one ever says to which varna one belongs. Okay, so this and again, we also have to see this as academic scholars like Balagangadhara have done, and later on now Professor Atluri, who has written about it, and then Saidibek Iyer, who has written this very popular book now on coloniality, how basically Western concepts, Western traditions, their grounding in their Christian ethos and their view of the worldview of Christians. But I might say here, because you mentioned Islam and how the Mughals basically try to kind of impose again or categorize people whom they did not really know but wanted to have some idea of how they can identify them, therefore they can deal with them. Okay, I believe the biggest kind of a problem that any monopolist or supremacist group has in dealing with diversity is that they want to ignore reality in the pursuit of their supremacist ideals, whether it is a religious ideal or if it's a political or a social ideal. So you will see that anyone who claims a monopoly on God, on truth, or one way of ordering or organizing society will have a lot of difficulty dealing with us Hindus, because we respond to what is in front of us, what is real. Difference is real, and we have used the difference to make life more rich. The sheer diversity that is India, that is in India, whether language, food habits, music, whatever we take, it is amazing that a country, a nation, an area like that could provide the ground for such diversity. And so those who are not used to that, those who want to equalize, and even in this name of creating a level playing field, which is the most absurd. I don't believe anyone can make a level playing field. For heaven's sakes, the world is round. It is not flat. Okay. These aspects, but which is very seductive. So for the young, and when we are young, we see the world uh, simplistically. We want to change the world. We want to correct, what we think are the mistakes people made. We want to, bring justice to everyone. We want to make everything right. But we don't know that in the real world, things are different. We come with different kinds of talents and potentials and efforts and discipline and all of those kinds of things, which we Hindus have recognized, acknowledged, and celebrate, and that which has led to this kind of burgeoning, flowering of different and beautiful stuff. But with any kind of discrimination also comes the potential for the wrong kinds of discrimination, and that is there across the world. Okay, but now coming back to this idea about why caste and jati has become a kind of an obsession, and the word jati is not, the term jati is not used, the caste has been imposed upon us. And once again, it is very seductive, very easy handle for those people who think that they can make the world equal, that there are good people and bad people, right people and wrong people, and that the right shall prevail, that the good shall prevail. In this obsession to create such a kind of world, we Hindus become easy targets. Okay. And we can see that whether it is, whether, in terms of the British, surveys, Risley, and so on. And, and what started as a kind of a cottage industry, now Indology and a variety. I mean, India is now such a rich and fertile ground for sociologists, anthropologists, linguists, feminists, any kind of social scientists or humanists, that they have made their life literally drawing upon the blood and sinews of India. And unfortunately, many of them these days are tempted literally to therefore disembowel India instead of being enriched by what we have to offer. And that, I believe, is also our problem, because our children who are now growing up or have grown up in this country have not had access to, or we have not given access to, or we have not celebrated what is our endowment in a way that they could then use it to make it part of the American, democratic ideal and dream. That
Yeah.
that we have that kind of freedom to kind of celebrate diversity. Okay, but with that, hand it over to you, Nikunji.
Naini, you
So
wanted to
this
talk about the
was,
slide, for
yeah,
example.
this
Yeah.
slide, right, where you talk about the academic deconstructing of this issue.
Yes, caste is, Indian. By the way, for those of you who really want to kind of get, it's not a sympathetic, but a thoughtful, positive, constructive assessment of India, please read Indian. Okay. Forget about us Indians, because we are biased, right? We always have to have the foreign expert give the final word. But, Indian, at the University of Chicago, unfortunately, the University of Chicago now is contaminated by the school of Wendy Doniger. They have ignored Indian. Uh, Indian caste is the main pillar of Indological constructs, and that because it was a handle, it was something that they could use to try and understand a society that was so diverse, had literally an excess of different, the facets that India reflected. um, so what they sought was, here again, why were they seeking that kind of a smoothing of differences? Was because of their Christian background, which, theologically and in terms of their own understanding of the nature of human sins and human ends, they wanted to literally level the Indian playing ground so that they could then understand who we are. So basically, he says that, with this use of caste had the effect of, because again, in terms of colonialism, if I want to dominate and control and colonize someone, why do I do it? Because I feel that they don't know, and that I have things to give them, that I am better, that I have knowledge, that my God is the one that can lead me to heaven, and all of those kinds of things. So in the pursuit of that, and in terms of affirming my own superiority, the Europeans and the British, as who came to dominate India, used caste to kind of characterize India and Indians, Hindus, as belonging to this kind of weak society, feminine, that we could not come to conclusions, that we did not have the kind of clarity, ignoring the fact that we were paying attention to reality, not some kind of an ideal that which sought to kill reality. So he says, Jati may be rethought itself. If we kind of want to help others understand where we come from, he says, Jati is a form of citizenship, which means, just like our First Amendment, which allows us to kind of belong and to protest and to, go where we want to, Jati is a way of forming communities based on certain kinds of interests. Most often, it is economic interest. Whether it is I as a carpenter, or in interest in vastu, or a farmer, or whatever, we know that we want to, kind of ensure the success of that pursuit. So belonging to those groups is a way of citizenship, and and again, to understand difference. And unfortunately now, because we have bought so much into these Western ideals, we have lost so much of the skills and talent that we had before. You wonder, what happened to the great architectural traditions, the vastu traditions that allowed us to build those amazingly gorgeous, complex temples that
Correct.
used, you know, uh, the knowledge about astronomy, about
Right.
engineering, all of those kinds of things. So this, and here I think, therefore, Indian must be read simply to kind of help us once again represent ourselves as to what jati has meant. But now, of course, I'm if I were to follow my traditional jati, and I wish now, as I get older, that I could indeed be nothing more than the one who pray to my deity and help people come in and also celebrate that. Okay, so
One thing that struck me in this quote as I look at it is, I don't know what era Indian was talking about, but he's saying that India was depicted as weak and feminine. Obviously, that was reflecting the Western morals of the time, when being macho and masculine was good, and so India was shown in a bad light by saying it's weak and feminine. Of course, now Western thinking has changed, and so now India is painted as like a patriarchal, rapist kind of place. It's the same culture, but apparently it was weak and feminine at one point, and is now like very patriarchal and anti-women. So it's very. This is a good segue actually into the next topic, which I wanted to bring up. Which was the narrative, right? The whole issue of what we read, which we can take on the slide. So what we hear and read about caste, right? Because you can see how Hinduism itself has flipped from being weak and feminine to macho and anti-women in just the space of a century. I don't know if Hindus themselves would say that they have changed that radically, but certainly those who write about us and talk about us say that. And we know that it's very important because that is what shapes opinions, even of young Americans of Indian origin or Hindu origin from different parts of the world, because we live in a world where perception, we both you and I come from the communication field, and there's an well-known adage that perception is reality. And perception is shaped by what we read in the media around us, how popular media depicts us, how other people talk about us. That is really what shapes us. And if you look about caste, right, since the Cisco lawsuit last year, there've probably been 100, maybe more articles talking about caste in Silicon Valley, caste in the US, caste among Indian Americans. And a casual observer, or even not so casual people growing up growing up here, might imagine that, my God, there is an absolute floodgate of like horrible stuff happening, being done by folks like us. There's 100 articles, which means so many people must have been feel discriminated against. But if you start to pick it apart, you see that all of these articles are referring back to that same one flawed survey that we started the conversation with, that 2018 Equality Labs survey. And what is it that makes journalists, very good quality journalists who are otherwise very competitive, why are they so repetitive in their coverage, right? The same survey mentioned over and over again, ignoring more mainstream sources of data that directly contradict what this survey is claiming. And the same one story of Cisco's lawsuit, which, by the way, we'll talk about it more later, but almost 2 years later, or a year and a half later, still stands in the court unproven. But the very existence of that lawsuit has been used to effectively declare the entire tech community as casteist and discriminatory. So I just want to help our viewers understand, what is it that, why does the media work this way? What's going on there?
Okay. Very quickly, for those of us, in the media, trained as journalists, worked as journalists, and now teaching about how the media function, we all know about, at least in terms of the traditional, say, newspaper, the amount of space that a newspaper had to publish news was limited. So, literally, the news hole was limited. So, let's say a daily newspaper, had 12 pages, in the print edition. And about 40% would go towards advertising. So, only 60% of that 12 pages was available for editors to offer news to the readers, and variety of those kinds of things. So it was limited, and therefore editors had the role of gatekeepers. Okay, there's this flood of information coming in, but we will be the ones who will choose and decide what is important, where it should go, and what is not important, and what should be discarded. Okay, that's the kind of a role that was initially basically forced by the limited space that was. Okay. The next part, it gets a little bit more tricky, and that is agenda setting. Okay. And here we see that, the ability of the media to influence the importance placed on the topics. What, what becomes your lead item? What is above the fold? What is below the fold? What goes into the back pages? what gets discarded, whose letter is going to be published even in the letters to the editor column, who gets space in the op-ed page, the opposite of the editorial page, who gets to write them, what kinds of views are we going to allow to be published in our newspaper, who do we consider as an expert, who do we rely upon to give their expert opinion on different aspects of society. All of that is part of the agenda setting. And it was there to a large extent, always. But now, given the fact that this idea of objectivity is become almost not just discarded, but demonized, because they say many people driven by the sense of wanting to bring justice and equality and equity and all of those kinds of buzz goals feel that there are good and bad people in this world. We can clearly identify who is good and who is bad, who is just and who is unjust, who is ethical and who is unethical, who is the one that should be supported to ensure the health of society, and who should be cancelled, disappeared. Okay, so this activist journalism is also another reason why suddenly we have this flood of reports on caste. And here again, everything, because these are literally both the journalistic media ecosystems and echo chambers. And who are the ones who becomes a journalist? They get their education in college, in universities. So it is academia that first shapes these journalists, who then go out and report about the world, but already framed in a way for them by their professors, by their teachers, about how to view the world. What kind of glass are you going to wear to look at the world? And how will you see it, and how you should see it? Okay. So when we connect media and academia, it is not, somehow trying to bring some two different spheres into explaining this stuff. This is naturally connected, because I am a teacher. I was a copy editor for the Hindu. I was in the trenches the year when Indira Gandhi was assassinated and the Bhopal gas tragedy happened. I was a copy editor for the Hindu. And I began to see changes in the Hindu then as Ram began to take over that year. I was interviewed by his brother and Ravi, and but I was trained as a journalist. I was trained at the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, and my teachers came from a tradition of journalism that really tried to have or to bring this sense of objectivity, clarity, precision into their reporting and writing. Whereas now what we have is this activism-led journalism, because we can't call it journalism. This is basically activism. Okay, variety, social, political activism, and it is easy also because we Hindus are easy targets, soft targets. However, they may wish to characterize muscular Hindutva. We are easy targets because we don't strap bombs onto our backs and blow ourselves up. We allow people to say whatever they want, and so we become very easy to demonize and to push us into corners. And we have been pushed into the corners, forced to play on our back foot, to use a cricket analogy. And that is very important in understanding the growth in this Hindu hate project that has become global. And when I say global, it's kind of mostly now Western European and America led, but you can see that in Canada, in Australia, and in New Zealand. And then, there are other actors who can happily latch on to this, whether it's the Chinese or whatever, for their own ends. And so it becomes, and this distraction basically can undermine a variety of projects, of healthy projects to make India, a really, a- that kind of dynamic place, so that the people, the rest of the world's people who have always considered India the spiritual land, now if it is demonized as this kind of devil's place, who would seek spirituality, right? There are all kinds of interesting, you know, both fallout and kind of agendas for this focus on caste.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So,
I think,
and I want to make one more point on the scholar, the activist journalist, and I'm going to give you an example that recently happened. San Francisco Chronicle recently came up with an article about caste. Okay, and they talked about UC Davis and what's going on at UC Davis. And we wrote a rebuttal on this. And it's really important for people to understand how this bias against Hindus works. So before the article came out, this same journalist interviewed CoHNA. Okay, the same journalist interviewed someone who identifies himself as a Dalit, and he's a prominent volunteer within the CoHNA team. Okay, and we're very proud of having him as a strong, dedicated Hindu voice. He was interviewed for 45 minutes by this journalist, and he was talking about how he embraces Hindu dharma and how he has been inspired and he found refuge from physical and sort of like physical abuse that he went through in his family, and Hindu dharma was the only place that he could find this refuge and shelter in, right? Apparently that story was not fitting her agenda. So she first of all never came on video. She cut the interview short and she said, I'm too busy. And we realized why she was too busy, because that narrative did not fit her, neat anti-Hindu narrative that she wanted to spin. And then comes out this San Francisco Chronicle article where she basically talks about this whole thing, completely ignoring the fact that she interviewed someone who actually has a different perspective, and she actually silenced that Dalit voice, right? And so this is the type of obsession about caste related to agenda setting that we are talking about here, right? And I just wanted to share that example because we can talk about theoretical stuff all we want, but here's a real concrete example of what actually happened recently. Okay. And we can go on and on with examples, but I think the San Francisco Chronicle is a recent example that illustrates how activist journalism works. This gatekeeping and agenda setting actually happens in real life.
Well,
and how it
yeah.
silences the very people, how it silences the very people that they're supposed to be championing. It doesn't matter if you happen to be the group that they're supposedly championing. If you don't parrot the narrative, it doesn't matter.
To give my own example here, I used to write for The Guardian, their online edition on Hinduism. And, I wrote a variety of articles, not just on Hindu aspects, Indian aspects, on Gandhi and so on. But then I asked the editor, this editor of that religion page, look, you have a complete separate page for Christianity. You have a completely separate page for Islam. You have page for I said, forget about a page for Hinduism. Can you have a page for Indic religions? Bring in Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and Hinduism. And then I started pitching him ideas about what I wanted to write about. Within about a couple of weeks, he came back and said, I don't want you to write anymore for me.
Wow.
So so unless you kind of toe a particular editorial line, and unless you are critical of Hindus, you cannot be critical of Sikhs or Muslims or Christians or Jains, but then Hindus are, as I said, easy target. And I am supposed to be as a someone who claims to be an expert and from, coming with a media background, to focus on criticizing Hinduism. Whereas I pointed out to him, look at your pages on Christianity and Islam. Where are those kinds of voices for us Hindus? So It is not merely, as Nikunj said, this is not merely abstract theoretical stuff. This is lived reality. Try and write a letter in support of Hindus or Modi to the New York Times and see whether it will be published.
Yeah.
Okay. Forget about getting an opinion piece. Okay.
Right. So I think the other point, this is a perfect segue into what we wanted to talk about. The other piece of this discussion is why should, when we talk about why should Indian Americans, Hindus, why should we care? Like, there's academic freedom, reporters can write what they feel like, academics can write what they feel like, universities are passing resolutions. It's okay, universities pass a law. I hear these justifications a lot, right? And I always try to explain it to them, but now, I was talking about it hypothetically, but now we're actually seeing these policies. And by, if you look at our chart, these policies literally were passed a couple of months ago, and we're already seeing the impact. Nikunj, if you want to share that next slide and talk about, what's going on in the academic world in terms of targeting. The next one. No, the one with the one with from Harvard, and yeah.
Yeah, so essentially what has happened is, like, you can see that different universities are starting to pass these resolutions. But and we'll talk about this, and if you look at the UC Davis one and the Harvard, in fact, there's more information about how Harvard, before this article, there was an article last year where there's a discussion talking about caste as a problem, okay, where Professor Ajanta Subramaniam of Harvard was quoted that the immigration system in America guarantees caste discrimination. I'm not even kidding you, this is actually in the article, and it was just printed as if it's truth, okay, just like literally printed, and said that, wow, the immigration system of the United States somehow is casteist and guarantees caste discrimination. This is what's in the article. So Harvard itself has had a series of very Hindu-phobic, anti-Hindu sentiment on campus, and there's a whole discussion that we can go into. So, but this is the recent one, that there was a caste bias protection. But if you look at this, right when this was approved, it says Dalit students began to come forward with their own experience of discrimination, including how South Asian supervisors and instructors give less attention to them versus that of upper caste students. Okay, how the heck did someone determine that? Did they Zoom bomb somewhere? They crashed into the Zoom session to see whether the professor was talking to an upper caste person or a lower caste person? Were they standing outside their professor's office to monitor as the gate, saying, okay, this upper caste guy went in, the lower caste guy went in, the lower caste guy was supposed to be there for like 30 minutes, but he only got 10 minutes, and the upper caste guy got 1 hour. Okay, and how the hell did they understand whether this guy is an upper caste or a lower caste? How did they even look it up? Did they look at their skin? If they looked at the skin, great. You know what? That's even worse, because as the original Cisco case talks about, that apparently upper caste Hindus are light-skinned, when lower caste Hindus are dark-skinned. Complete nonsense, because here you have 3 different types of people sitting right here of different skin colors, and you can guess who is who in that sense, right? So all those things are going on.
Should be able to guess, right?
You won't be able to guess. I mean, maybe
No,
my
I'm
last
saying,
name gives
but
it away.
If
Or
we
something.
listen to the experts, then we should be able to guess.
Yes, exactly. So-called experts. So the point is, so this is the Harvard one, but look at the UC Davis one. Okay, UC San Diego. Really, really dangerous here. Look at the top of this thing. It says, we understand that caste supremacy is sidelined as caste privileged people continue to circulate simply as people of color. So when we bring up discrimination against people of color, i.e. people like us, it's somehow there's caste supremacy in there. But next one is very interesting. So if in this particular situation, it's not there, but if you look at the actual, the snapshot doesn't show, but I'm going to read this here. It says, against the commonly circulated idea that only South Asians, specifically Hindus, should care about caste, we understand caste as a 25-year-old system of dehumanization that made Dalits, those outside the Brahminical caste systems, into untouchables, as non-humans who could be killed with impunity. Okay, remember this sentence now, and it's not here, unfortunately, but we can share this. But it says somehow there's a 2,500-year-old, so there's a date assigned. Again, we know where that date is coming from, a very colonial construct of the world, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, it talks about how that there is a system of dehumanization where Dalits were somehow there was a license by Hindus to kill Dalits with impunity. That is a very, very dangerous statement. But the fact that a ethnic studies department adds such dangerous language, and then it says, go on to says that we're now going to work to recruit more Dalit faculty members, more Muslim faculty members, etc. Somehow, Muslims are oppressed by this casteist society, Hindu society also. So Muslims, Dalits, Adivasis. This is the very copy paste language of equality labs. Okay, and in that same one, there's a whole paragraph where they say, as the 2018 survey on caste in the United States by Equality Labs, the Dalit Civil Rights Organ shows 40% of Dalit students reported facing discrimination, so on and so forth. Again, copy paste language from an openly Hindu hating group that is known to have very dangerously anti-Hindu views. This is how academia, and then followed by that media, whitewashes this sort of racism and anti-Hinduism, and then puts a rubber stamp on this thing. So I think this is a very important thing that people should really, really be concerned about.
And I think it's, so academia is one thing. And the next slide, Nikunj, if you want to talk about, is the infamous Cisco lawsuit.
Yes.
That we have discussed, and we could probably spend 2 hours discussing it. But, again, just to context set, obviously the Cisco lawsuit, nothing has been decided. We have no particular information, but we are just drawing on some public. So what we're seeing here is pulls from public documentations, public legal filings that were made by Cisco and some of the defendants. So this is all matter of public record.
That's correct. And if you look at this public record, and this is the amazing part, we talked about how media should really be doing their homework, right? Media failed to do its homework or deliberately ignored the, sort of some of these filings. So you can look over here. It talks about the fact that, there's knowing intention that this particular person who was accused of being casteist, Mr. Sundar Iyer, for example, and Romana Compella, who filed this thing, it says that I actually recruited and hired that person, that Dalit person, for a local position on the project, but also promoted him, right? Offered him the head of engineering role before this whole thing even happened. So if this person was casteist, why would that person offer this person a head of engineering role? There's so many things. And then it goes into how the Department of the Fair Employment and Housing, DFEH, just took a 15-minute interview of this person, okay, subjecting him to public ridicule and embarrassment, basically while John Doe hides in an anonymous way, but this other person, Sundar Iyer, has now become like the global poster boy for caste discrimination, right? So his reputation has been completely tarnished. But the fact that a 15-minute interview then goes on to a actual big lawsuit and all these things, right? So there's so many things that are publicly available. This document is publicly available, and I'm going to show you the next one.
And I think just before we move on, I think this is so important for everybody in the community to realize, because the question is, how does this impact me? Right? When we hear about these lawsuits, when we read these biased articles, when we read about the academic resolutions, we're like, well, okay, but this doesn't impact me in my day-to-day life. Well, guess what? Most of us work in the corporate sector. Here's how it's going to impact you, right? Because most of us don't even know the caste of our teammates, our supervisors, the people we manage. And workplaces do have conflict. I have had bosses who didn't like me, or with who I thought were not giving me fair chances. But now I have a chance to go back and say, if they were of South Asian origin, we could bring a caste angle into every dispute. I have been asked to submit 3 status reports. Oh my God, is there a caste angle now? I have been given an extra deadline and had to give up my weekend. Is there a caste angle here? I mean, I don't know how any of us is going to work because we actually now have to start figuring out the caste of everybody we work with and, managing them accordingly, or working with them with walking around on eggshells if somebody happens to be from a different background. So I think this is, again, a question of constructing caste quite literally in our lives where it didn't exist.
Yeah. And if you look at the next slide, which I'm going to show you, a layperson started this change.org petition, I think last year or earlier this year, I'm not sure. But they were able to actually look at this whole case and say that it's, based on what their reading was, it appears that the alleged Dalit who claims to be a victim never applied for the head of engineering job that he alleges was not given. So how can one get a job that one never applied for, right? Second thing, this person mentioned Mr. Iyer's declaration shows that 2 head positions in the group, including the position that alleged Dalit victim complained about, were given to a Dalit professional way before the complaints were made. So a position was already given to another Dalit person. So how is there caste discrimination, right? So, and then this person actually, point number 4, talks about where the public documents are available. All of this, and I spoke with a journalist as well from the Indian background. He said that I, as a journalist, can go in and actually get this information. So someone from San Francisco Chronicle or Washington Post or New York Times should have access to this, and they should have done their due diligence, but they did not, or they willfully did not, because of the fact that they will have an agenda setting. As you mentioned, the gatekeeping, agenda setting, and the scholar journalism or the activist journalism kicks in, and they want to only show Hindus as casteist, as violent people, somehow that who need to be dismantled, essentially, right? And no CEO can then proudly talk about being openly Hindu without being subjected to caste, as we saw with Twitter, right? Twitter CEO was essentially, within a matter of less than 24 hours, a couple of hours, he was accused of being a Brahmin, which he's not even also, and then casteist, and now will Twitter talk about caste? It's like, just the guy was just appointed, and Jack Dorsey did not look at his caste to appoint him as a CEO, right? He's not saying, oh, let me appoint an upper caste Hindu to be a CEO of Twitter, right? And same thing across the board. But apparently that's the criteria. But because according to Ajanta Subramanian, again, U.S. immigration guarantees caste discrimination, right? According to her. So this is the kind of narrative that is given academic heft and then put into media and then sealed into a policy, right? You see that there's a cascading effect. First, the media, the academia endorses it. Then the media takes that academia. There's this whole kind of circular references in many ways, referring to each other. There's a loop. And then finally, it legislates into a policy, whether it's a workplace discrimination policy or a school discrimination policy, etc., without doing the due diligence, right? And somebody in the chat box talked about UC Davis's Danisha Nichols. Yes, there was a Yahoo article where she's the head of diversity and inclusion or something, or anti-discrimination, got a presentation for Equality Labs and automatically concluded that there is caste discrimination. And so now they decided to add something called caste or perceived caste. What the heck is a perceived caste? God knows. But apparently, if you have some kind of perception of caste at UC Davis, you could be subjected to anti-discrimination policies. Now, this stuff, I'm not making it up. It's all there. And we have highlighted this on the CoHNA website in our rebuttals. But this is the kind of dangerous precedent that is being set. And this is what our community needs to be mindful of. That, like Professor Rao, you are a professor on college campus, right? This could directly target you. But some student who holds a grudge against you, has an axe to grind against you, you gave him her a bad grade, shows up and says, well, Professor Rao is a casteist, and therefore he discriminated against me, did not give me enough hours compared to other people, so on and so. I mean, there's no, and before you even get a chance to prove this, right, your reputation is tarnished already.
Yeah, it's not just, a South Asian student accusing me of bias and casteism, because caste is conflated with race. And given the kinds of times that we live in, where all of us faculty are, looked at as potentially discriminating. I could be by a Latino student or a Black student or a female student saying, oh, because why? Because Ramesh Rao is a Hindu casteist. Because suddenly, whoever was, my 35 years of teaching experience out the window, my Hindu identity becomes, front and center. And that, and again, this is not merely hypothetical, because they are clearly saying we want to hire these kinds of people and not hire these kinds of people. They will not say we will not hire these kinds of people. They'll say we want to hire these kinds of people. So this, and here again, it's an interesting kind of an exchange that is going on here in terms of India, the kinds of reservation systems, who is allowed, who is not allowed. Literally, in a state like Tamil Nadu, about 80%, 85% of seats are reserved. Okay. And there is so much of that now coming here to the US. We are both bringing it as baggage, and we are enabling, our collaborators here then to kind of misuse this categorization into demonizing a particular group. We are a micro minority in this country, but we have
Absolutely.
become easy targets. And this is, as I said, amazing to me in terms of how viral this has become over the past few years.
Yeah, and we asked this question to the Santa Clara Commission. Okay, let's say you have a caste policy. How are you going to know the caste? Are you going to have a roster on caste, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to put it in some kind of a book that says the book of castes? Okay, there's 5,000 castes. Let's do let's figure out what this person's caste is. And by the way,
yep.
how
And
the heck
that's
are you
just
going
in
to know?
India. It's 5,000 castes just in India, right? But
Yeah.
they talk South Asia. South Asia is 8 countries,
Yes.
out of which most don't have any kind of legal boundaries around caste either. So this is a nightmare that nobody is willing to explain.
Exactly. And then on top of that, what's really interesting to me, and this is a slide that we had shown, right? You have in Bihar, you have this category of other backward classes, right? OBC. That is very different than Uttar Pradesh. That is very different than Tamil Nadu. That is very different than Gujarat. Okay, they might be, so there's like 300 OBC, let's say, for 400 OBCs in one state. That list will be entirely different in a different state. So is the Santa Clara Commission or one of these universities are going to sit around and determine where is a person is coming from? So now where do you draw the line, and who's going to adjudicate this? Is Equality Labs is who's going to adjudicate this, right? Is who's going to be responsible for making sure that you can understand the caste and then perceived caste?
Yeah, most probably Equality Labs will be given a few $1 million to come up with those planned lists. But the other question to be asked here is, since there is a caste kind of identity even among within Christian groups, Sikh groups, Muslim groups in South Asia, will that be used in terms of caste identification from people in those communities? Or is it going to be only for Hindus? I mean, there are all of those kinds of things. But
yeah, and as you point out here, right? Is it going to be put into census and surveys? Is it going to be in visa applications? Is it going to be in student admissions? Where does this whole thing come in? This caste identity marker. And what about American Hindus? Hindus born and raised, right now, a lot of times our session really, or because many of us are Indian immigrants, right? A lot of us go back to the Indian conversation. But I don't want to talk about India. I want to talk about America. This is a legal issue, a policy issue happening in America. Why the hell are you using Indian categories to talk about American Hindus? There are kids who are born and raised here, right? Who don't barely even identify themselves Indian, right? A lot of times they don't understand the Indian dynamics. They don't understand any of this stuff. Are they going to be subjected to this type of policy? And the answer is yes. They're not saying that this policy only applies to Indian students and this and that. They're talking about a policy that applies to anyone who is supposedly has a caste or a perceived caste. And I think
it's actually very racist, because it's almost like, for those of you familiar with American history, there used to be a rule when in the days of slavery about one drop of what constituted blacks. If intermarriage happened, or people of mixed races, what made them black versus non-black? Because in those days it was a serious issue in terms of personal liberty and freedom. And there were actually these laws about one drop of blood and you're black. And I mean, are we really entering the modern era of that, where one South Asian ancestor and you are condemned to be you have some genetic gene in you that discriminates and is nasty and puts down people, and that carries with you no matter where you go? That is exactly the theory that is being mainstreamed right now, that this particular group from South Asia is more discriminatory, because bad people exist in every society. Bad stuff happens among every group. So we're never decrying that bad stuff doesn't happen in India, Hinduism, or even people living here. But no other group is considered to have that as a genetic problem that follows them in any country that they go to, or through generations, no matter the context they grow in. And I'm surprised that social justice warriors internalize that and say that proudly.
Yeah, and believe me, there is actually a phenomenon like that. It was called the Criminal Tribes Act. Okay, in the 19th century, there was the British policy actually put in a thing called a Criminal Tribes Act, and 100 million people today live under the shadows of the Criminal Tribes Act, where it actually said that by birth and by ancestry, you are inherently a certain way and a criminal. So if you're born in a particular jati, and that if that jati is determined to be a criminal, not only are you a criminal, your children are your criminals, your family is criminal, everything else. And we are seeing a repeat of that Criminal Tribes Act in America in many ways.
And this goes also against the First Amendment.
Yes.
Because what? The First Amendment is all about not making laws about affecting religion and so on. And basically, it robs me of the freedom to claim the identity that I want to. So that, I mean, here again, there is rich material here for constitutional experts, for others in the social sciences, to look into how this whole attempt at demonizing us affects American law.
Correct.
And what are the consequences? These are really dangerous consequences.
Yep. And you can see that in this slide that we show that Hindus apparently must identify with a caste and subscribe to a religious hierarchy, no matter what they say. So if an American Hindu born and raised here who barely knows Hinduism is apparently a suspect in the eyes of law or in policy, the moment he or she shows up on college campus or at workplace, oh my God, this guy's brown or this girl's brown. Oh, it must be casteist. Right? They must be, and what about white Hindus? What about black Hindus? What about Hispanic Hindus, right? Where do they stand, right? So when you start to think about caste, so that's why we are very, very concerned about this thing. And it reinforces the stereotype. See, what happens is in 6th grade, 7th grade textbooks, you're learning about, as one student had mentioned, in a 6-page or 7-page description on ancient India, the word caste appeared like 35 to 40 times. Okay. So what did you learn? Caste, 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 right? And so it reinforces this idea, a stereotype of a Hinduism in the minds of the non-Hindus, right? The kids who are around you. And then you can see in California, one of the schools, right when the Cisco case happened, that was discussed as part of ancient India and Hinduism. Okay, that Cisco case was actually discussed there. So all of a sudden, you would have 3 days to learn about these things, and you're learning a major case that is familiar in Silicon Valley, and apparently Hinduism is blamed for that, right? And then on top of that, when you're hiring Hindus, there could be systemic discrimination. When the employer, if I'm a manager, right, and I'm a non-Hindu manager, if I'm hiring a Hindu person to manage a team, am I going to be looking at caste discrimination policy and saying, well, should I really hire this person because I'll have to deal with a lot of headache because Hindus come with caste and I don't want to have a Hindu in me. So you're singling out a minority minority tradition with a bad lack of understanding. This manager doesn't even know Hinduism 101. And then on top of that, he or she is now forced to make a decision on whether to hire someone like this or not based on this warped understanding of a society. And it's relying on heavily biased and anti-Hindu groups who are now pushing for this legislation and then training, right? So the same group, it's like a white supremacist providing data on racism and then going and educating the community. Let me tell you what racism really is.
I like to say it's contacting David Duke to do diversity training on how to handle people of color or blacks. But I think the other point that Nikunji was making is it's not just one manager, right? We all work in corporates. We know that costs become a big issue. If hiring South Asians comes with so much administrative overhead, where now companies have to be doing constant caste training, making caste sensitivity, that's a lot of overhead administrative cost that comes. And at some point they'll be like, man, hiring South Asians or Hindus specifically gets us into a lot of HR overhead. Maybe, maybe we need to kind of find a less racist group of people to hire from, never mind their phenomenal skills in science or math. So I think those of us who feel our skills in science and math will win out need to realize that there's a lot of bean counting that goes on in companies, and areas that drive costs are looked at and get more scrutiny and ultimately start to get deprioritized. That's just how companies work.
And I think the more dangerous dynamic that I see here, in terms of what I started out with, we have kind of strange bedfellows here in this targeting of Hindus. So you see the kind of left progressive socially, social equality, equity people joining hands with fundamentalist Christians, extremist Islamists, violent Khalistanis in demonizing Hindus. They are all together in this project, and you begin to wonder what it is that kind of enables this dynamic. And so here again, and this is not merely theoretical, but what happened, for example, in Uganda, under Idi Amin, literally overnight, Indians, majority Hindus, were driven out of the country. We will have to look at the kind of extremism, left extremism, that kind of made Cambodia, suffer such an onslaught and lose its, its intellectuals, its really, the elite, the intelligentsia of that society. And if we don't push back, if we don't highlight the weaknesses in this project of demonizing Hindus, we could very easily see the momentum gain the kind of traction that our very lives are in danger.
Yeah. And people don't realize when they don't read American history. This has happened in America in the 80s and 90s, right? Late 80s, early 90s, let's say. There was a Dot Busters campaign that happened in Jersey City where Hindus were basically targeted because of the bindi and tilak. So that happened. But earlier in the 20th century, Hindus were driven out of Washington State. Okay, there's an article that talks about 600 or so Hindus were driven out of Washington State. Again, a great case of Hindu phobia. So this has happened in America. Okay, it happens today in certain places, but these are two important incidents that have happened in America as part of American history that many people don't realize. That and that's how genocide also started, right? When the Holocaust of Jews, when it started, it wasn't an overnight event. It was a 10+ year event where Jews were systematically caricaturized as privileged, as sort of like blood-sucking people, all this nonsense that was portrayed against them. And then the population was primed to then say, you know what, this is how. So when Hitler and the Nazis committed atrocities against Jews, there was not a lot of resistance because the communities were already seasoned or sort of like, given that brainwashing that these are actually bad people, right? So it has happened throughout history to people such as the Jews, even to Hindus, like different types of people, right? Minorities in various places. So to think that it cannot happen to Hindus in America, that is ridiculous.
I think
Because it can.
Even 5 years ago, people would have laughed at the thought of Diwali and Holi being targeted. Yet here we are, and today you have young kids from our own community who decry those festivals as violent or casteist. We're actually, I know we are kind of coming close to the time, so I want to let's remind the audience to ask any questions. There is a question that came in that I want to just bring up. Is there an overlap? We talk a lot about academia. Is there an overlap with the academics who are driving caste and the academics that we saw driving the DGH conference that happened in September?
But of course, in some ways, as I said, this ecosystem here, and this is also something where I have to take some blame in terms of the kind of research that I could have done to connect the kind of networking that has happened between academics in India and academics here in the US, and the kinds of agenda setting, the kind of training that they have given to their students, and those students coming and earning their positions at Ivy League schools, and they are now part of this whole movement to kind of again target us. And whether they conflate Hinduism with Hindutva, all of those kinds of things have become the kind of tricks of the trade within this ecosystem. So yes, we can and we should make those connections. And unfortunately, on the, so many Hindus are, we go on with our lives. We don't, we just mind our business. And the idea that we should be, spending our lives doing this kind of work to see who is targeting us, we don't even see the worth of it. But if we don't do it, we will forget, or we will ignore the fact that this is a systematic, programmatic campaign to demonize us. And these are all people coming from the same ecosystem.
Yeah, and we have
Yeah,
done some of the mapping.
very quickly,
Yeah.
A person, who wrote an article against Seva International for Slate magazine, we found out this young copy editor come reporter for Slate is friends on Twitter with Peter Friedrich, who is one of the most Hindu-phobic activists that we know. So they are literally, in fact, collaborating right in, under our noses, in front of our eyes.
Yeah, and David Rubin has written an excellent article on this recently that we tweeted on our Twitter handle. So, and we have done some of the mapping. If you look at the people who organized the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference and the academics who signed, so 1,100 academics signed in support, right? If you look at some of those names for the past 30 to 40 years, some of them. You have dealt with them, and it's the same type of people, but a new generation of the same ecosystem that is being spawned by these folks who are in the academia. And then some people who have no idea, but they just basically blindly sign because they want to support social justice, right? And they're being fed these lies that this entire Hindutva movement, or whatever you want to call it, needs to be dismantled because it's apparently worse than Nazism. And in fact, it inspired, right? So there's in the DGH conference, you had a professor who openly claimed that Hinduism inspired Nazism. I mean, how can you even get away with that? Which academic, and none of the 1,100 academics even condemned this thing. Okay, so that's the thing that we. So, anyways, continuing on, I think we have a few more questions. You're on mute.
I think if you remember, we did a congressional briefing on the deep biases, the institutional biases against Hindus in academia specifically. We could probably do one on media too. But I think that Indu Vishwanathan ji and Lavanya Vemsani ji both brought out the kind of systemic biases they faced just for doing their work. Like Lavanya ji was targeted because she put out a very innocuous call for papers on a listserv. And Induji had this very interesting conversation about the patterns you see, where you see these kind of, where you see a cluster of Hindu-phobic professors, and the patterns you see emanating from that very quickly get into real life. So
an initial example of this is, Ramrani Yevetrosser, who did a wonderful dissertation, and it took her forever to get a PhD from the University of Texas.
Awesome. Yep.
And then before that, Shrikant Talageri, who has written about the Aryan invasion issues, Michael Witzel invited him to Harvard, but on the condition that basically he give up his thesis and his research to become a student. So literally, this is what they are offering is brainwashing. It is not science. It is not scholarly inquiry. It is ideological brainwashing. Unfortunately, so much, and this is again not necessarily confined to Hinduism studies. This is a kind of a virus now that is basically sapping the energies of academia the world over, especially in the West. But for us Hindus, this, as I said, this is programmatic, and there is no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
So I think there's a lot of questions, but there's a theme to some of them, which is obviously what can we do? Obviously, there's no magic wand to fix this, but what can folks interested? What are some of the small steps we can think about individually as a community?
There's no 3-minute answer. Unfortunately, people want a 3-minute answer or 270 character whatever answer. There is none. Okay, so please do not expect CoHNA or anybody to be your savior and say, oh, we're going to give you a 3-minute answer to this thing. But we can help you attend our workshops to equip you, have those conversations, learn, study, right? Read articles, understand the patterns. And we have every month or every 2 months, we have different sessions going on, like this session today. So understand, and then go get into the field. The way to learn, and I used to learn martial arts. So the way to learn martial arts is not to study in a book. You have to actually fight. You have to get into the ring and fight. Okay. So get into that ring and have the conversations and have the debates with people, and then write stuff and challenge the narratives. If you don't do that, no one's going to come to save you. Okay. Hindus can only save themselves. Don't expect somebody, some organization or someone to come and save you in that sense. So please don't have that mindset.
Yeah, and quickly, you have to establish contact with your, state representative, your congressperson, okay, and then you got to read. We all have to read. That's something that I keep reminding. And really, the next big and demanding step is to write. I'm the chief editor of India Facts. We focus mostly on Hindu phobia, and I keep asking people to write for us because there are literally a million pieces that we can write in a month. Because if you just subscribe to Google Alerts, you will see the list of articles targeting us. You pick one article, respond to it, write to me, I will publish it. I will help you even edit it. I spend half my waking hours editing other people's works. Okay, we are willing to give our time and energy, but we expect that people who are concerned about it really, instead of merely exchanging concern on WhatsApp and social media and so on, to be a little bit more disciplined. Because without that discipline, we cannot really bring about this kind of changes or protect our community from these kinds of assaults.
Yeah.
I would also add that we live in a democracy. There is a lot of power in the grassroots, and I think that's where CoHNA's focus actually comes from. We realize there is power in all the small little institutions that surround us that we are too busy with, or frankly, it's boring work. It's very boring work to engage with your city council, with your school boards, because 95% of the time they will be talking very arcane, process oriented stuff but if you don't engage, others are engaging and others are creating a conversation about you. So the more we all have to engage with whoever, wherever. People are like, where? I'm like, what are you part of? What networks are you part of? What groups are you part of? Is it a company? Is it a school? Is it your library? Is it your neighborhood? There is stuff happening in all of those places. So honestly, once you start taking it on, there's way more to do than you will have time for.
Yeah,
It's
and
not a
WhatsApp
problem of,
University is not the answer. And WhatsApp University is not the answer to solve life's problems. You may get nice information on there, but please get out of WhatsApp University and actually do real work. That's where real things happen.
Yeah, and finally, a bit of a caution. And I've seen this, well-meaning, friends, family members will say something basically uninformed about Hinduism. And we do more harm to ourselves by piping up when we have not bothered to inform ourselves, to educate ourselves.
absolutely. Yeah,
And
the,
that
the
is
level of
because
ignorance about Hinduism in our own community is astonishing. Yet that doesn't, and everyone says it's too complex, but which is fine. It may be complex, but then at least hold off on passing judgments on something that you yourself are saying is too complex for you to have studied. So if
No,
it's too complex, don't. I am not a math or science person, so I don't pass judgments on scientific issues because I don't want to engage there. I would be very easy if you just did that. Too complex for you to understand Hinduism, just don't become an expert on it or don't pass judgment. But even that's asking for too much.
no, but I mean, physics, astronomy, biology, I mean, astrophysics, thermodynamics, complex quantitative financial theories. Everything is complex to understand. But guess what? We don't go around saying, "Oh, it's too complex to understand. I'm not going to use this." Oh, in my job, I'm in finance, for example. I use formulas. I'm not going to go question where the hell the formulas came from. Why should I understand the formulas? No, I just use them with the faith, with the understanding that the people who created these systems knew what they were talking about. So I think at some point we also need to have some faith in our ancestors that they actually discovered these things that have been used by thousands of people around the world, millions, to make their lives better. And here we are always questioning our ancestors and our tradition and our dharma, but we don't question anybody else. We don't question anybody else, but we are always questioning our own things. And that's the self-defeating mentality that has been internalized. This colonization, internal colonization, has led us to question everything Hindu. That somehow, if something is good, it's too good to be true. So why don't we trust our ancestors that they were not necessarily what the media has portrayed us to be?
Absolutely. So I think we have gone way over our allocated hour. This was a very enlightening discussion. Lots of comments and questions. And I think, as Nikunji said, we will keep the door open. At CoHNA, we try to do our bit by trying to provide a lot of education and resources on caste, on Hindu phobia, on several other topics. So do engage with our website. Do come to our events. We actually will have a caste workshop, a more in-depth 2-hour discussion where we dig into some of the points we made today and help you understand. And everything is backed up with evidence. We don't make claims without evidence. So do join us, engage us for that. And do please, if we can do anything, if we can inspire you to make one small action in your day-to-day life, whether it's the schools that your kids go to, the workplace that you are part of, the organizations that you are part of, or even just engaging to educate yourself more and then get ready for action. That would be very helpful. Any closing thoughts? Nikunji and Dr. Rao?
Rameshji, please go ahead first.
Yeah. Once again, just it's good to be here. This is an important topic, and it's not merely a topic. This is something that is essential in our lives. I really hope that we will continue to talk about it. It's very important also not to lose our heads about this, because one of the things that we Hindus have also been given, the wonderful gift, is how to deal with this Maya and Leela aspects of life. So let us deal with this in a disciplined way, attentive way, but also let's do it in a way that shows the kinds of strength of character about us Hindus. So anytime, if we need to come back and visit this, I'm here. So
no, I echo those sentiments. I think ultimately, we have to tell our story, and we have not been telling our story in many ways. So we put our heads down and just do, bache, beta, just go and study, do the math. Don't worry about the rest, right? While other people set their narratives. It's not the math guy or the girl who creates the policies in the world. It's the journalist, the media personality, the academic, and the politicians that create policies, while the rest of us become bean counters. So we need to understand that there is Arjuna had to wake up. There is a challenge in front of us. We have two options that, we can basically ignore it, put our heads in the sand, or do something about it. There are organizations like CoHNA and many others who are giving you the resources. Go and look those up. India Facts has lots of resources on Hinduism in general, but caste also. So read those as a 6-page analysis of that book, Caste Western. What is it? The Western origins of the caste system. Wonderfully done by India Facts. There's so much information that's available out there. We just need to spend. It's like brushing teeth. You do spend 5 minutes every day brushing your teeth, and you do not say, I'm not going to brush my teeth today because I don't have time. So spend that 5-10 minutes every day brushing your mind with this information and get sharp. Hindus have a lot of smart people. We need to make sure that we can use our intellect in that direction and not just bean counting and managing our careers. That is important. But let's also make sure that we can protect and preserve our dharma.
With that, thank you, everybody. This was a long conversation, a pretty deep conversation, and we hope to do more and stay engaged. Thank you and namaste.
Namaste.